Good afternoon. We're going to roll right into the next panel, so if you could please take your seats, and we'll get started in a microsecond. Thank you very much. As I looked at our agenda a couple of days ago, I thought this was going to be one of the most exciting, one of the most important panels that we've had here this week. It's entitled Israel at a Crossroads. And one way we could think of it, Israel, the state of Israel, is that the state of Israel is in its strongest position since May 14th, 1948, the date of its birth, relative to the other powers in the Middle East than it's ever been. That is very good news for the state of Israel. I would say personally, that's very good news for the United States as well. The other framing point is that Iran, a significant adversary of the United States during our entire working lifetimes for those of us in the U.S. government, Iran's at its weakest point as a military and political power in the Middle East since the Iranian Revolution of 1978 and 1979. That's good for the state of Israel, and that's good, absolutely, for the United States. So we have, as moderator, one of the best informed journalists working in Mary Louise Kelly of National Public Radio. And we have an extraordinary cast of people, 2 Israelis and 2 Americans. My friend, Amos Yadlin, and I've been working with Amos for a long time, is president and founder of Mind Israel. He's former Israeli military intelligence chief, and as some of you may know, was the lead pilot in attacking the Osirak reactor and eliminating it on June 6th, 1981. He's a legendary figure in the state of Israel. Michael Herzog fought in many of Israel's wars, 2 as a leader of the IDF, and then found another challenging assignment as ambassador of Israel to the United States and did that job very, very well. He's now a distinguished fellow, a Tisch Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Those are the 2 Israelis in the panel. The 2 Americans, Brett McGurk. Brett has been a significant senior American troubleshooter, diplomat, peace negotiator in the Middle East from the George W. Bush administration forward, and was one of the key people in the Biden administration reacting to and shaping the extraordinary events of the last couple of years: Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, Iran, Israel. And Dan Senor, someone I've known a long time and deeply admired, of course now at Elliott Management, but author of the great book, Israel as a Startup Nation, someone who's lived in Israel, knows Israel very well. I don't think we could have a better panel, so I'm looking forward to this. Thank you all for being here. Mary Louise.
Good afternoon, everybody. Nick, thank you. In my business, the title of a panel, Israel at the Crossroads, is what we would call an evergreen. When is Israel ever not at a crossroads? General Ambassador Brett, Dan, welcome. That panel title is calling to mind words credited to Orson Welles, the actor, director, who said, if you want a happy ending, that depends where you stop the story. Flip it around. Think about where you start the story. In the Middle East, we could pick any of 1,000 moments over many thousands of years. But for our purposes today, we are going to pick 648 days ago, October 7th, 2023. And we're going to look at what has changed for Israel and its neighbors and what maybe hasn't. Brett McGurk, I'm going to give you first word. You were serving in the White House. You were President Biden's top advisor on the Middle East. You found out about the attacks of October 7th because you got a call from somebody else on this stage today. Tell the story.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and this is an extraordinary panel. I'm just honored to be on this stage with all of you. So it was October 6th for us, Friday, And a busy day at the White House, actually had delegations of officials from other regional capitals, including the Saudis and others, talking about where the region was. We were working on some things that were potentially going to be quite positive over the coming 6 months, year. And I went home and I put my daughter to bed, and I starting to unwind from the week a little bit. I knew I'd be back in the White House in the morning, as we always are. And I started to get reports of rocket attacks from Gaza, which was not totally unusual. We had had an 11-day war in 2021, but still, we hadn't seen that in a while. And then they started to come a little more rapid fire, starting around 10 o'clock. And actually, I got a message from you, Mike, at 10:23 p.m. on Friday night saying, it's a massive attack, this is war. And I think we talked a few times that night. And as it unfolded, I was up the entire night, and I knew at that moment the Middle East would never be the same. I could just see what was happening. It was a multi-front invasion from Hamas. We still did not know the scope and extent that would unfold over the coming hours and days, but I knew it was something we'd never seen before, and everything had changed.
Ambassador, pick up the story. Where were you that night? How did you find out? And did you share the assessment the Middle East was never going to be the same?
So it was October 6th. First, it's a pleasure to be here and share the panel. All of them are friends, and especially privileged that Brett is here, because Brett was the best partner that I could wish for. We worked very closely during the war. It was October 6th. I was with my wife in southwest US. It was the eve of a Jewish holiday. Late at night, I get a call from an Israeli senior general. He's shouting into the phone, Mike, this is war. It's not another round, it's a war. Hamas started war, and he hung up. I had no idea what he was talking about. I had no clue. So I called my defense attaché, who just landed in the US. He didn't know anything. I look at the website, and I see massive rocket firing from Gaza into Israel. I connected the dots. I saw some reports about infiltrations. I understood that this is war. And I also understood that this could also escalate into a war with the whole Iranian axis, because Hamas was an Iranian proxy. And I've seen the intelligence of how they built together this concept of encircling Israel with a ring of fire. So first thing I did, I canceled all my plans. I put all the senior people in our embassy on a conference call. I said, this is war. We're switching to a war mode 24/7. And then I communicated with Brett. I wrote him, this is war. We need your support. And Brett wrote me immediately, we are with you.
Yeah. So I suspect most of us in this room have tracked pretty closely what has unfolded in the months since. I'm going to direct this next one more to you, Ambassador, and then I want Dan and you, General, to jump in. We are where we are. What will count as a victory in Gaza?
That's a very big question. So I want to analyze Gaza through the goals that our government set for the war in Gaza since October 7. The government set 4 goals: to defeat Hamas militarily, to remove Hamas from power, to release all of our hostages, and to make sure that Gaza no longer poses a threat to the state of Israel. While we excelled in our military operations, and it's not a minor thing because Hamas built over the years a major underground terror complex, 400 miles of terror tunnels. There's no comparison anywhere in the world. At the same time, we did not develop a coherent plan, alternatives to Hamas, who and what is going to replace Hamas. It's not for lack of thinking about it. We had a lot of groups. I was part of them. It's for lack of political decisions, political pressures within our governments, and a lot of disagreements. The great ideas General Petraeus-like ideas of seizing territory, claiming that territory from Hamas, and creating a basis for alternatives, but we never developed a coherent plan. We worked together with the United Arab Emirates, and I was part of that work, and we finalized nearly all the work, but it was too late in the day. And here we are 20 months later, and when we talk about our military operation in Gaza, nobody can tell you what's the alternative to Hamas. We also have a big problem with stabilizing the flow of humanitarian assistance into Gaza. That is because throughout the month, most of this assistance which came through UN agencies fell into the hands of Hamas and fed its governance. So we are at a crossroad, and we have to find a way to exit this war.
Yeah, I have follow-ups on that, but let me bring you in, Dan. President Trump initially floated that his plan for Gaza and what would count as victory would be that it would be emptied, that 2 million Palestinians would go somewhere else, not clear where. What is the state of Trump administration thinking on Gaza as best as you can make out, and to what extent does the personal relationship between Trump and Netanyahu influence it?
Sure. I'll just, before I answer that, I just want to just respond to one thing Mike said. I do think one of the challenges for Israel, here you're going to be tougher in your own government than I'll be. One of the challenges for Israel is their military was never designed to fight the kind of war it is fighting in Gaza for the length of time it is fighting this war. The Israeli wars were always supposed to be short and away games, preferably, not home games. And this is right on Israel's border, and here we are, October will be 2 years, and Israel's still fighting this war. And Mike alluded, to these points that humanitarian aid is a huge problem where it's Israel's responsibility, according to the international community, to get humanitarian aid, figure out a way to get aid into Israel. You can't point to another war like this where the one party is responsible for getting aid to the enemy's population while the enemy is taking that aid and using it as leverage against its own population. And of course, the hostages, proportionate to the U.S. population, it's the equivalent of like having thousands and thousands of U.S. citizens underground in tunnels being held hostage while you're trying to fight this enemy. So for a variety of, in the Ring of Fire you mentioned, for a variety of reasons, this was not a terribly easy war to fight, and the Palestinian population has generally been terrified of Hamas. It's not so easy to develop an alternative within the Palestinian population in Gaza if the population is terrified to stick its neck out and say, I'll be the alternative to Hamas. Keep in mind, the architect of October 7th, Yahya Sinwar, he was in an Israeli prison for, I don't know, what was it, almost 20 years, not for killing Israelis, but for slaughtering Palestinians, for imposing retribution against Palestinians that, quote unquote, collaborated with the Israelis. So I do think putting it on Israel to find an alternative to Hamas is not terribly easy. I do not think
I will just point out that Israel is continuing to fight there for this amount of time by choice. There was a ceasefire.
Well, there was an interim ceasefire. I think the idea that there could be a permanent ceasefire would only work if Israel would agree for Hamas to stay in Gaza. And that, back to Mike's point, in terms of the objectives of the war, there's no world in which Israel can agree to Hamas staying in power in Gaza, when the war is over. That means the war is not over.
Go to the U.S.
Yeah, so look, I do not believe the relocation of the population out of Gaza is going to happen, at least not at scale. There's actually been a little bit of it happening, but it's not the solution. I think at this point, and I think June 13th to June 22nd was a turning point, was an inflection point. Ultimately the joint Israel-U.S. war against Iran, because you cannot look at the war in Gaza in isolation, right? It would be like looking at World War II and saying, hey, what did you think of the U.S.-Italian War of 1943? Like, no one talks about these individual battlefronts in World War II. You talk about World War II. Israel has been fighting this ring of fire, the 7-front war, of which Gaza is one front. And the head of the octopus was Iran. And the fact that Israel and the U.S. had such extraordinary success against Iran means I do think, and I just returned from Israel this morning, there is a sense that there's an inflection point now if Israel and the U.S. are looking for a way to gradually wind things down, this is actually the ideal point. The question is this population. How do you separate the population from Hamas? And I just spent a few days in Israel, I still have not heard of a concrete plan for doing that. And so as Israelis are repopulating southern Israel, it's not going to be so easy to build those communities back up in southern Israel if they know that a Palestinian population that is not separated from Hamas is going to reemerge up there in northern Gaza. So I think the primary goal right now, if there's going to be any kind of permanent solution, is to move the Palestinian population as far south deep into Gaza as possible, so there's a big perimeter, a big security area.
I'll pause you 1 second, because I suspect others may want to jump in, and I want to get the general in, but do you want to offer us a quick thought on my question, the Trump-Netanyahu relationship?
I have, and this is new, by the way, I did not see this in the first Trump term, and I didn't even see this at the beginning of this Trump term, but when I talked to officials in Israel and I talked to officials in the Trump administration, I've never seen a closer relationship between an Israeli prime minister and a U.S. president, as we're seeing now. We can get into why that is. But there is a real sense that President Trump sees in Israel an extraordinarily successful military and intelligence juggernaut, and President Trump likes being associated with success and awe, and they definitely see, the Trump administration definitely sees this alliance with Israel as providing real capabilities to the United States in the Middle East that it did not have. And so I think, I would compare it to like Bush, Blair, Reagan, Thatcher. That's how deep the relationship is now. It'll be interesting to see if it sustains, but right now it's pretty extraordinary and unprecedented.
Do you want to weigh in on anything you just heard? If not, I have another question for the two of you.
Yes, I think we need to go beyond Gaza, because Gaza have started it. Israel is fighting the most justified war ever. However, at that moment, continuing the war is not serving Israeli interest. I think...
in what sense?
In the sense that we, as Dan said, our defense doctrine is saying the wars of Israel should be short and with decisive victory. That's what we have done vis-à-vis Hezbollah. That's what we have done vis-à-vis Iran. And Gaza is different because of the hostages, because of the underground tunnels that they have prepared, and most of all, because Hamas is using the population of Gaza to shield himself. He's not caring about the fact that this population is starved, that this population is bombed. He uses them against Israel, and Israel is losing the public opinion fight because we are continuing this war. Nobody remembers the 7th of October and how much this war is justified. So I would put on the table the end of the war as something that Israel will contribute to the end of the war for all the hostages, all of them in one pulse. And then Gaza will not rebuild without demilitarized. We have to coordinate with our friends in the Arab world that they will take over Gaza and rebuild it only if it will demilitarize. And then Israel has the right, if Hamas stay, to attack Hamas again, because this is a terror organization that threatens us. And we have done it to, we done a very good agreement with Brett about Hezbollah, that if Hezbollah is not comply with 1701 UN Security Council resolution, that they have to go north of the Litani River and not smuggle weapons to Lebanon, the Lebanese army will do the job, and if they are not doing the job, Israel is doing the job. And this is happening as we speak. So this model should be applied to Gaza, and we should look at what the end of the war is promising us. It's promising us an opportunity to shape the Middle East differently, a normalization with more Arab countries, American, Israeli, Arab, moderate camp against Iran, excess of evil, against the Islamists, and making a different Middle East. And on the issue of President Trump, I think for the first time, American president preempt against a nuclear program in a rogue country. It was not done against North Korea. It was not done against China, not even against the Soviet Union in the 40s. So President Trump showed to the Americans that the Middle East is not only a place that you are losing. It's a place that you can bring a lot of good interest for America. His voyage to the Gulf, the $3 trillion investment, and the fact that Iran is now weakened, and Iran, excess of evil is not exist because Hezbollah, the most formidable proxy, was destroyed, Assad regime was collapsed, and Iran is much weaker.
Okay, so we're going to move to Iran and the wider region, please. Two things. I want to note you're wearing the yellow lapel pin. Several of you are. This is in support of hostages, the hostages, and bringing them home. Just for those who don't know it, this is something you see everywhere now on the streets in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, and Israel. One more question, because you opened the door to this, General, after telling me right before we walked on stage you didn't want to talk about Gaza. I am curious for the two Israelis on this panel, how you see the moral stakes for your country of the staggering toll of death and suffering we are seeing in Gaza. And I know that's a difficult question as an official. Would either of you care to answer it as a human, as an Israeli?
I think this is one of the reasons we have to finish the war. Because our enemy, as I said, he is to blame. He is to blame for starting the war. He is to blame for holding these hostages. And this is the huge humanitarian issue, because this is people.
But do you feel the weight of this?
640 days are in tunnels. Try to be 8 hours in a tunnel. 8 hours, that's all. Without light, without nobody beating you, torturing you, and then you will understand what these people are going through. After saying that, I'm not happy from what's happening to the Palestinians in Gaza. I think if Hamas leaders would have been cared about their people, they would have stopped the war, bring back the hostages a year ago, a year and a half ago. And I think, once again, it was Brett who said that you cannot blame the Israeli government on that, you blame Hamas. But I think we should put on the table a proposal that Hamas cannot refuse, because they are saying end the war.
Okay. Let me shift us to Iran, and I'll steer this to you first.
Let me just say real quick, on ending the war, because this history is being rewritten by people who weren't involved in it. Just some dates. May 27th, there's a deal put down. Israel accepts it. It has about 85% of everything Hamas wants. The war could stop. On May 28th, Joe Biden made a speech on May 31st, laid it out to the world. The UN Security Council unanimously adopted it. If Hamas said yes, the war stops. Hamas did not answer. They answered on July 2nd, about 6 weeks later, and fundamentally changed the whole thing. We then patched it up on August 16th. We put down a proposal with Qatar and Egypt. It had about 95% of everything Hamas wanted. And again, they did not say yes. They didn't answer. 2 weeks later, we had a number of hostages killed in a tunnel under Rafah. And then Israel decided to go north and took out Hezbollah, and that changed Hamas's calculations. We finally got the deal. I just want to make clear, like, the moral toll of this awful situation tears at the soul of anyone who's worked on this. Anyone. But this war could stop. It could have stopped multiple times if Hamas stopped the war and released hostages. Multiple times. And where we are right now, there's a deal on the table to stop the war for 60 days. That's a long time. And where we are, given where we are, I think you stop the war for 60 days, it is the end of the war. It is the end of the war. And we're still negotiating over maps. And all the pressure comes on Israel, which I get. And by the way, we should be, and I hope President Trump's putting pressure on Israel to get to a point where we can close the deal. But there's like no pressure on Hamas to just release 10 hostages, we stop the war for 60 days. I mean, this is a fundamental issue from the beginning. I'll just finish this here.
Yep.
Hamas started the war on October 7th. This panel's about Israel, but the enemies of Israel have agency. Hamas started the war. Hezbollah joined the war on October 8th. All the militias in Iraq started shooting at us and at Israel right away. Iran enabling the whole thing through Syria. And then the Houthis join in. And then Iran joins in directly. All the enemies of Israel made a choice to start this war against Israel, okay?
Okay.
And Hamas from the beginning said, fundamental demand, you can have the hostages, we stay in power. We stay in security control, and that is still their demand today. They have not budged on that.
Hold on, Ambassador, and then I am going to shift us to Iran. Please.
So I agree with everything Brett said. I would like to add the following. Look, Hamas put us in an impossible situation because they built a whole military complex within civilian populated areas. They built under the hospitals, the mosque and everything, and they put us in an impossible situation because if you don't take action against them, they win. And if you take action against them, there necessarily is collateral damage, and any loss of life is tragic. But what I want to say, the art of policy is to translate military success into a political exit. We found the right way in Lebanon. After we hit Hezbollah very hard, we did a ceasefire deal. Brett was there, we did it together, and that was a very successful exit because it put political pressure on Hezbollah, which never was there for decades. We have yet to find a way on Iran, we'll discuss it, but we did not find a way on Gaza. And here I want to say that as war dragged on, the tension between those two war goals of removing Hamas from power and releasing the hostages became intensified more and more. Both of them are worthy goals. I support nobody wants this Hamas in power after this war. They should not be there. But here we are 20 months after that war started, it was forced on us, and we need to find the right sequence. And I, like Amos and many other Israelis, believe that it's time to put an offer to release all the hostages and stop the war for now, and we'll deal with Hamas later. In the meantime, we focus on Iran, we expand the circle of normalization in the region, and we start a healing process in our own society, which is traumatized since October 7th, and that process will not start until all the hostages are back.
Can I just very quickly?
Hold on.
Oh, yeah.
If it's a sentence,
It's
a sentence.
You keep referring to Lebanon as the model. In Lebanon, you had ultimately the Lebanese government and the Lebanese army. It wasn't a vacuum. In Gaza, it's Hamas. No other Arab country is stepping in.
Agreed.
We talk about the Saudis, we talk about the Emiratis, we talk about the Egyptians. No one wants to show up. Amos, I was just in Israel, and everyone was talking about demilitarizing Gaza. We just got to demilitarize Gaza. Sounds great. Who's going to do it? If IDF soldiers are sitting there patting down every Palestinian look for a gun, you're going to have a lot of dead IDF soldiers.
Okay.
And the Saudis and the Emiratis don't want to send their young men to do that job.
Okay.
Demilitarize doesn't say that you are get rid of the last Kalashnikov. This is like an American having a family having a car. So they have Kalashnikov, but they will not have rockets, they will not have drones, they will not have commando forces training to capture a kibbutz and kill and burn and rape. This will be a different Hamas if they will choose to be there, but nobody will rebuild them. So the idea, they already gave up the governance. They now have to give up the weapon, and some of their leadership have to go out. And this is easy to achieve. And the Emirates and the Saudis will come, and they will know that if Hamas is gone, in the term of demilitarization for reconstruction, then I think, you know why the Arabs will come? Because of President Trump. Because for the first time, he came with this idea of removing 2 million Palestinians. To where? And the Arabs are against him. And suddenly they are willing to put some skin in the game that they were not willing to do a time ago. And I think you cannot destroy an idea. You cannot destroy a religious belief. ISIS was defeated by a coalition of 85 countries led by Brett McGurk and General Allen. And they were defeated, but they are still there in the mosque, on the internet. You cannot defeat them on their belief, but you can make sure that 7th of October will never happen again.
Hear, hear. Let's do Iran, and I want you each to take a quick bite at this. did we all overestimate Iran? And if so, if the military was not as formidable as many intelligence services, militaries seem to believe, what might that tell us about the political leadership? Dan, you first, and we'll come
I
down.
don't think Israel and the U.S. overestimated the threat from Iran. It was
Not the threat, but the military capabilities.
The capabilities. What Iran had built up, invested billions of dollars in years, was in a proxy system. It wasn't its conventional military that was the real capability. It was its proxy system. It was the Houthis, it was Hezbollah, it was Hamas, it was militias in Iraq. And after October 7th, as Israel over time systematically started eliminating the proxy system, culminating, of course, in taking down Hezbollah, if you think about the three inputs Israel needed to go into Iran, it was the threat of Hezbollah there, breathing down its throat, removed. It needed to be able to get basically through Syria in the air into Iran. Assad regime falls in December after 53 years. And then, of course, you had to, so it was the Assad regime gone, it was Hezbollah gone, and then it was Israel's extraordinary intelligence. Now, it had the extraordinary intelligence before, but those two other factors, Assad falling and Hezbollah falling, and then the whole proxy system being broken down, that was the capability that Iran had, and Israel systematically took it out. Without taking out the proxy system, I don't think Israel could have done it.
Yeah, General.
I don't think we overestimate Iran. I think we underestimate Israel and its capabilities. And it's not only the intelligence. It's much more the Air Force and the combination between the two. The capability to achieve air superiority in a place like Tehran. It's not Gaza, it's not Beirut. It's 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers. Air superiority. Russia and Ukraine are fighting 2.5 years, and none of them achieve air superiority. Here, in 2.5 days, air superiority was established. And then the beginning of the war, with intelligence to decapitate the leadership of the Iranian military, the IRGC, 15 most important commanders and generals. And in the same time, a couple of scientists who were in the groups that started to work on weaponization, which was the last step, because they already have enough fissile material, enriched uranium, for 10 bombs in 60%. To move them to military grade, 90%, it's 2 weeks. And weaponization was the next. To do this took decapitation of a whole group. You need amazingly good intelligence and the capability to launch the missile or the bomb to intercept them in the right place. Some of them were on moving from their houses to their command posts. Yeah. And the Israeli intelligence and the Israeli Air Force were able to move the bomb and the missile to the right place.
So I'm hearing from two of you, very little surprise at how the attacks by Israel and then the United States played out, and the feebleness, I think is not too strong a word, of Iran's response. Brett?
Let me give a couple anecdotes to kind of make your point. So October 8th, fog of war. Is this a coordinated attack? Hezbollah is joining the attack. Hezbollah is kind of maneuvering. Are they going to attack Iran? Like, what is going on? And if it was the coordinated attack, Israel faced an existential threat. I mean, one of the first calls from President Biden to Prime Minister Netanyahu is either on the 7th or the 8th. But Netanyahu said, Joe, we're in the Middle East, and in the Middle East, if you're weak, you're roadkill. And like everybody's sharpening their knives. And that's what was happening. So the power of Israel, of Iran at that moment, I do not think we were underestimated, nor do I think we did underestimate it. Now let me fast forward just a few days, because on October 11th, the Israelis believe they saw indications of Hezbollah preparing a ground invasion of Israel. And we were trying to figure out what was going on, and Israel was thinking about a preemptive attack. And we discussed it throughout 5 very intense hours of that day, And one of the arguments against a preemptive attack at that time was that Hezbollah still had full strength, 150,000, 200,000 missiles and rockets, everything else. Is this the best time to start a new front? I think there's some debate about this. I think it was the right call not to start that front at that time. But finally, on October 1st, I'm in the Situation Room with 200 ballistic missiles fired from Iran at Israel. Did Israel attack Iran? No. Israel took out Hezbollah on his borders and some IRGC people that were in Syria planning attacks against Israel. And Iran launched 200 ballistic missiles against Israeli cities. That was like the worst case scenario, and a missile takes about 12 minutes to fly. You have only about 3 minutes to take them down. But there's about 9 minutes of silence as you're just watching these missiles streak across the screen. And I thought to myself, everything I know about Iran, everything I've dealt with Iran, this country that would do this can, first of all, never have a nuclear weapon. And we were bracing for hundreds, if not thousands, of casualties. Now, fortunately, we defeated that attack. And then Israel very effectively took out Iran's air defense systems, which set the conditions for what happened. So no, I do not think we underestimated Iran. I think the force of arms of Israel in the Middle East, responding to attacks against them, with very close coordination from the United States, and with work done across administrations over many, many years, led to where we are now.
Ambassador, I'll give you last word on the Iran question, and then we're going to open it up to a couple from y'all. I'm curious, given your diplomatic background, we're hearing the description of Israel, starting with Nick Burns introducing us. Israel has defeated or seriously degraded its enemies, from Hamas to Hezbollah to the Houthis to Iran itself.
The Houthis not yet.
Department of multiple things can both be true. That is true. Israel also finds itself more isolated. Something approaching a pariah on the international stage because of what has happened in Gaza. How do you reconcile those?
So first, I agree with my co-panelists that we do not overestimate Iran. You have to remember that Israel prepared this war for decades, for many, many years, especially the last few months, for decades. And first, we dismantled the Iranian Axis. We took away their shields, Hezbollah, Syria, air defense, and so on, and some of the air defense capabilities in Iran itself in October, in the strike in October. But in the strike itself in June, we first achieved surprise, and we hit the main center of gravity in their nuclear program, missile program, air defense system, and the senior defense official dome. And that took them totally off balance. They were planning a massive retaliation against Israel. They were thinking that we were going to may attack them, and they were planning, but they couldn't execute it, just couldn't carry it out. Now, you're right about your question about Israel's international standing and so on. It's something that I had to deal with extensively as ambassador here. And people don't realize, we Israelis often talk about us fighting on 7 fronts. That's a military campaign, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the rest of the Iranian Axis. But there is another front, which is an international front, a campaign to delegitimize the state of Israel, to cast us as an immoral entity. And this is another war that we have to fight in parallel, war of narratives and perceptions. And I think we should do a better job at that.
Your questions. Saw this gentleman in the front center here first. Please keep it short. Please keep it a question.
Yep. My question is directed at Brett on looking back at your time at the White House. What's your biggest regret on Abraham Accords expansion and the lack thereof during your tenure?
I don't know, I think we did a lot of work to set the conditions for which I think eventually will happen. I got to say, this issue is kind of described as we were like chasing this white whale. Like, look, Israel came to us early, and other countries, including Saudi Arabia, came to us early and said, hey, help us kind of facilitate, and we did. I wish it was done. It suddenly became front page news, like the whole thing. It should have been done much more quietly, and it should be done quietly. and I think ultimately it will happen. So what knocked it off was Hamas. Look, Hamas does not want that vision for the region, and Iran does not want that vision for the region. And I think the fact that you now have a much stronger Israel and a strong Israel-U.S. relationship is important to this. I think those deals eventually will happen, not in the immediate term, but looking over the coming months and years, I think we'll eventually get there. But Gaza has to get into a ceasefire, and that war has to end.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much for the information. Back to the conference, it says we have to rethink organizations and the way we've done things here in the States and how we rebuild nations, et cetera. The panel is Crossroads for Israel. And back to the point on the different front wars we're fighting here in Israel. Not only the government or the political wars, but America. On October 8th, college campuses and American kids all over America chanted death to Israel and all sorts of, the Intifada and all sorts of things. And the media, to this day, says things like the detainees in Gaza instead of the hostages. So my question is to the panel, whoever wants to answer it, what are we to tell our college students, our university heads, the people in Qatar that are funding these programs and funding these things, and the media in America that continues to demonize Israel, inadvertently or advertently, but they do it, and that's a big war. That's the biggest war I think we have to fight right now.
Dan, you want to take that one?
Yeah, other than the shock of the shattering of Israel in the day on October 7th and days after, what was most jarring to me was I honestly, naively, I say now, naively believed that the outrage of the world after October 7th would be directed at those massacring Jews. I did not think the outrage of the world would be directed at Jews for objecting to being massacred. But that's exactly what happened, including on college campuses. And to be clear, when questions about the moral stakes and should Israel be concerned about the moral stakes, the heated rhetoric and accusations, apartheid, genocide, all of that, war crimes that we're hearing today, we were hearing being thrown at Israel, hurled at Israel on October 8th, at Harvard, in Times Square, at this Melbourne Orchestra, Symphony or Opera House in Australia. There were chants outside the Opera House, gas the Jews. I mean, this October 7th, for reasons that are beyond the scope of this conversation, brought something to the surface that was not about the way Israel has operated in Gaza. It was like it was triggered by the attack, and Jews being under siege was the trigger moment for the kind of the trying to drive Jews underground. As it relates to colleges, there's a reckoning in higher education right now, in elite higher education happening on a range of fronts. And I would just say, rather than focusing on which foreign government is funding which college campus, I mean, it's not a waste of time, look at that. But we all, I'm sure many people in this room, are trustees of universities and donors to universities and parents of students who are going to universities. These elite universities, what we've been raised to believe are elite universities, are making our kids dumber. They are making our kids dumber. Now, they're not just indoctrinating them, they are making them dumber. And so, if Jews are not comfortable at these universities, and they shouldn't be, they should go to other universities. There are plenty of rising star post-secondary institutions of higher education around the country, especially in the South. Some that have really been rising the last couple of years. And I think investing in institutions that are actually have a real sense about the difference between right and wrong, and actually believe in defending Western civilization and not attacking it every day, and tenuring professors that attack Western civilization every day, are worthy of the support of people in the room and this room and people you know.
If I may, I would add Jews, and I'm sure you would agree, Jews should be welcome at all American universities, as should everyone. Last question, this gentleman right here in the blazer. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Mary Louise. Edward Joseph, Johns Hopkins SAIS. Question for General Yadlin and maybe Ambassador Herzog. would like to answer as well. You mentioned the Iranian uranium stockpile as a key reason why Israel needed to act. I believe you mentioned in your New York Times op-ed as well. Well, of course, that uranium stockpile now is missing, although perhaps Israeli intelligence knows more about that. So what can you say about continuing Iranian capacity in the nuclear realm? And I would give you the opportunity, and Ambassador Herzog, to address the argument that you hear that, with respect to the Iranian nuclear program, Israel and the region and the United States would still be better off under the Obama JCPOA. Anything you want to say about Syria, you're welcome to do so. Thank you.
General, feel free to make news. Where is the missing uranium?
Okay. I think the missing uranium is was not the target or the objective of the attack. When you develop a nuclear bomb, if you are not a nuclear engineer, you need the fissile material, you need all the bomb, the weaponization, the core that is transferred from 90% gas enriched uranium into a metal, and then the implosion, and then the fusing, and then integration into a missile. And all this very complex kind of system was attacked. Nobody thought that it can destroy the 60% enriched uranium, which was nothing if you cannot enrich it to 90% and weaponize it. So the question, and then I want to go into a more important issue, whether we move them back couple of months, as New York Times and CNN are saying, or 2 or 3 years, as the president and Fox are saying, it's not important. What is important is what next. What kind of agreement there will be achieved. It must be better than the JCPOA of 2015. That was not a bad agreement, but it was a good agreement for the first 7 years, and catastrophic agreement to the last 7 years. So if we close the loopholes in the JCPOA, which is inspection everywhere, every time, no sunset, no release of the limitation, no sunset, and no weaponization, as it was not covered well in the JCPOA, then the attack achieved its goal, to stop Iran from reach the nuclear bomb. However, the ball is in the Iranian yard. They may decide not to come to negotiate. They may decide to try and re-establish their program. Then the ball is again in Jerusalem and DC. What are we doing if we see the Iranians going forward? It is not going to be easy for them, because for the first time, the Iranians know that what they thought before was wrong, that America has the capability but don't have the will, and Israel has the will, but not has the capability. Now they know that Israel has the capabilities, and America may have the will. So they have to be very careful. And it's up to us whether we can enforce them not to go forward again into the goal that they only have to, it was an empty goal, that they have only have to decide to go to the bomb, and they were there without capability to stop them that we have now.
Ambassador, a final thought.
There are a couple of questions that surround the Iranian issue following the war. The first question is, what are the residual capabilities that are left in Iran in terms of uranium stockpiles, centrifuges, nuclear infrastructure, missile infrastructure, and so on? I believe, for one, that we hit them very hard and took them, way back. But we don't have the full answer, because a lot of this is buried underground. It'll take months to get to it, so we don't have the full answer. The second question, what impact did this war have on the Iranian thinking, strategy, and planning ahead? There are those who think that it will motivate Iran to race to a nuclear device so that they can announce it and then immunize themselves against attack, like North Korea. I, for one, think differently. I think they will go very slow and very careful, because they are deterred, because they are exposed, because we can fly over Iran at will, and because they know that what Israel and the US did to them, we can do it again. So they have to be very careful, and that has to be factored into the picture when you talk about the time span. The third question is, how do we maintain the achievement of the war? And here, there are two courses of action. One is to get Iran back to the table and secure a deal, a different one than the JCPOA, no enrichment in Iran, and intrusive inspection. And there are people in Israel who are not in love with this option because Iran is left to give, and they will want sanctions relief, and with that money they can build off capabilities. But the alternative is to enforce our interests so that they cannot rebuild their capabilities. It's also complicated, 1,000 miles away, many dilemmas, what you hit, what you don't hit, they will fire back.
Right.
Challenges ahead. Fourth question that I want to raise, I don't want to discuss it. What impact will this have on the Iranian internal scene? Because the regime, I believe, lost the majority of the population. There is a deep divide, and I hope that this will deepen that divide.
To be continued in the Iran panel that is still ahead of us in the forum. Thank you to you all. Thanks for a great conversation.
Okay, Ling Ling, you bet, you bet. Okay, please take your seats. Thank you so much. Please take your seats. And if we can have silence in the room, that would be helpful. Please take your seats. Thank you very much. One note on your program. Adam Bowler, who is the Trump administration's hostage negotiator, is going to be with us tomorrow, not today. And we're not quite sure of the time, but you'll let you know on the website the time that he's going to speak to us about his important responsibilities. That was an extraordinary panel on Israel at a crossroads. Now we're going to go to China, or go back to China, I should say. Could we just have silence in the back of the room, please? Thank you so much. This panel is going to tackle a set of issues that is 1,000 kilometers wide and 10,000 kilometers deep. And that's the future of the China challenge for the United States, for Europe, for Japan, for Australia, for many other countries. And yesterday we talked about the panoply of competition between the US and China, where we could cooperate, and I think the need to live in peace in the decades ahead. We have an extraordinary panel chaired by Ling Wei of the Wall Street Journal, who does remarkable reporting. If you haven't seen her recent article, which I have now read twice, on how President Xi is planning to strengthen China vis-a-vis the United States, I thought it was a really effective article. With her will be a good friend of mine, to her left, Steve Biegun. Steve was Deputy Secretary of State in President Trump's first term. He was the North Korea negotiator. He's a veteran of the George W. Bush administration. He is a member of the Aspen Strategy Group. And Steve has very much kept current with US-China relations. In fact, I think I saw Steve maybe 4 times in China during my ambassadorship, so I deeply value Steve. I also deeply value my friend of 25 years, Reinhard Bütikofer, who's a senior advisor at the European Policy Center, former member of the European Parliament, and we have met on this issue on at least 3 continents, and someone who has a lot to say from the European perspective. And last but definitely not least, Liz Economy, lifelong expert on China and the United States, co-director of the US-China program at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University. And Liz was the senior advisor to Secretary Gina Raimondo, and Secretary Raimondo played a central role in our export controls, in our strategy towards China, and Liz was a key colleague of mine. And I want to thank her for everything she did. So we have a great panel. This is going to be an interesting discussion. Ling, thank you for being here. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Burns. Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you to the Aspen Strategy Group for convening this vital discussion, China Challenge. And I am extremely honored to be here with Steve, Reinhard, and Liz. For many years, the West has debated the nature of China Challenge. And many say now that the debate is over. The challenge is here. It is urgent, and it is evolving. Beijing has demonstrated its willingness to use its economic leverage, from its dominance in critical minerals to its influence over global supply chains. It has become more aggressive and sophisticated in pushing its influence overseas. The Chinese military is reaching deeper into the Pacific. This all forces a fundamental question upon Washington and its European allies, a question that will be at the heart of our discussion today. What is the true nature, what is the true extent of the leverage the United States and its allies have over China? And most importantly, what is the right approach to use that leverage effectively to counter the China challenge? To help us answer all those questions, we have an outstanding panel with us today. And Ambassador Burns just gave us a really great introduction of all 3 panelists. So now let's dive in. I'll start with Steve. 6 months into the Trump administration, we have already seen quite a few twists and turns in terms of the posture toward China. We have seen the Trump administration going from applying maximum tariff pressure to trying to align with other nations to, quote, isolate China economically, to now trying to engage China in trade economic negotiations. So what do you think? Does the Trump administration have a coherent China strategy?
Thank you, Ling Ling. And certainly a great question to ask, and one that I think confounds many foreign policy observers, and it also confounds many of our partners and friends around the world and some of our adversaries. But I think the mistake that's often made is that people understand that President Trump is not a conventional politician. He's an unconventional politician by any measure. And they also understand he has very unconventional views. He's unconstrained by precedent, by what's come before. In some cases, it can be alarming when he questions fundamentals like the NATO alliance. In other cases, where he tries a leader-to-leader approach to resolve the issues on the Korean Peninsula. But he's unconstrained, certainly, by what's come before. But the mistake that I think our partners and many observers make with President Trump is accepting that he was an unconventional leader and accepting he has unconventional views. They try to understand him in a conventional manner. And so what does that mean? It has two dimensions when it comes to something like developing a strategy for China. The first is that in a traditional administration, when the president makes a policy pronouncement, that's the policy, and that's a reasonable assumption. So, for example, when President Biden made the announcement, we're going to withdraw from Afghanistan, 2 weeks later, regardless of the consequences, we withdrew from Afghanistan. But President Trump in 2020 made a similar order. He instructed the government to immediately withdraw all U.S. forces from Afghanistan in December of 2020. The senior team, policymakers, outside voices, cabinet, all came together, a rolling set of meetings with the president, and ultimately the president recalled the executive order that he had signed that day and tore it up and withdrew the order for the immediate withdrawal of Afghanistan out of reflection of what were considered to be the likely serious ramifications for that action. And the lesson here is in a conventional presidency, when the president makes a policy announcement, that's the policy, and that's when the debate stops. But in the Trump administration, when the president makes an announcement of the policy, that's when the debate begins. And that's really how it is in the Trump administration. And if you understand that as you watch him publicly pushing forward, pulling back, raising the temperature, retreating, sometimes dropping things altogether when they seem to have fallen flat. Like, when's the last time the president talked about annexing Gaza to build the new Riviera? It's not in his lexicon anymore. Ukraine policy is a great example of this. Pushes forward, retreats, puts more pressure on Ukraine, comes back to Russia, and that's where we are now. So that's the first thing. The second thing to understand about the Trump administration is the Trump administration doesn't make China policy. The Trump world makes China policy. And the Trump world is occupied by different voices. The most important voice, of course, is the President of the United States. And when he makes decisions in the Trump world, those decisions are his to make. But the Trump administration is a coalition. It's a coalition of MAGA. It's got traditional Republicans. It's got career officials working in it. And then outside the Trump administration, you have a business community. You have an expert community. You have both inside and the outside administration. You have economic nationalists and isolationists. And this is a coalition that the president constantly has to manage. And a couple times in recent, just in the recent week, we've seen him really struggle to manage the divisions inside that coalition on some domestic policies. But when the president owns the policy, he sucks all the air out of the space. He owns it. And so from 2017 to 2020, President Trump owned the China policy, and the Trump administration was in the background. But in 2020, when the president made a decision based in part upon his concern about both the political and health repercussions from the COVID-19 pandemic, the electoral implications for that in his reelection in 2020, he really turned on China, and he withdrew from the China debate. He created a lot more space, and I'd say 90%, certainly the vast majority of the measures that were enacted to put coercion and pressure against China happened in that last year administration. So where we are today is the president is occupying the bulk of that space.
And the strategy for the president is very different than the strategy for the Trump administration. The president wants an economic deal, and he's pushing very hard to negotiate that deal. But if the president reaches the conclusion that that negotiation is not going to go anywhere, he's very likely to retreat from that space, and you're going to see a lot more initiatives coming out of the Trump administration. They're going to be put a lot of pressure on China, and so predictably, China has a strategy too. China's strategy was to start the negotiations as soon as possible and conduct them as long as possible, because the day those negotiations end is the day that the pressure begins to ramp up again. So that I don't expect the Chinese to move very quickly to address the president's concerns, but that's the president's strategy.
Thank you so much. It's hugely insightful and left us a lot more follow-up questions to ask you of. Then I'll go to Reinhard. First of all, let's congratulate Reinhard, because the Chinese just lifted sanctions on him. So what specifically did you do that make them lift sanctions on you?
Well, I guess the Chinese are hoping that by employing a tactic of minimal charm and maximum pressure, they could possibly convince the European Union to somehow return to the status quo ante and to re-engage about a comprehensive agreement on investment that was negotiated between Xi Jinping's leadership and Merkel's leadership roughly 5 years ago, and that we successfully killed in the European Parliament, and which is now, notwithstanding all Chinese illusions, dead as a doornail. So I think they will find out that they're on the wrong track still. But I think it's, we shouldn't keep our enemy from making mistake.
Great. That gives us hope. You know, hopefully they can keep correcting their wrongs. So the question for you, Reinhard, is that there seems to be a growing strategic divergence between some of the U.S. actions on China and EU's more measured approach, with past transatlantic initiatives like the TTC facing headwinds and China's industrial and data policies posing a direct challenge to Europe. Do you think if the EU now is at an inflection point, and what will it take for Brussels to coalesce around a more assertive and unified China strategy, sorry?
Well, Ling Ling, I think no good student of European history would ever earnestly expect Europe to speak with one voice. But that's not really a relevant measure. There will be distractions and there will be back and forth. But I think when you look at the direction of travel, there's not so much of a difference. And there are even similarities. Stephen just cautiously indicated that maybe there is not yet a fully developed stringent strategy on the part of the Trump administration. I would say the same about the Europeans. And of course, we have different points of departure. But when you compare the state of play, the state of not only conversation, but also the state of action in Europe today, with the situation 5 years ago when CAI was negotiated, it's 180 degrees different. The inflection point is not ahead of us. We have realized that we are at an inflection point, and we're taking action accordingly. I think the basic understanding that it took very long to really find a lot of agreement for, but that is now prevalent, is the understanding, in the words of the president of the European Chamber of Commerce in China, that there is a real risk of deindustrialization of Europe made in China. And that has changed everything. In the past, the economic relationship was the backbone of the win-win philosophy. Today, the economic dimension of the relationship is the main battlefield. And when you look at some important actors from the business community, the German Federation of Industry has been a leader in this transformation of our thinking. But there have been other associations that would traditionally criticize me for being too hawkish on China. They have come around. The German Association of the Machine Tool Industry just published a paper that is full of very harsh demands on what policymakers should do to stop the industrialization made in China. I believe that Mrs. von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, is aptly giving a voice to that understanding that is not universally shared, but widely shared. There may have been some equivocation in the meantime, yes. When I heard her speech at Davos, I was not fully convinced, but what she said at the G7, or more recently in the European Parliament, was clear as could be. And an important factor is also that Germany has found a more clear position. Under the leadership of Chancellor Merkel, the European term systemic rivalry was never uttered by the Chancellor. The following government, the so-called traffic light government, signed on to that European policy, saying, yes, we agree China is a partner and a competitor and a systemic rival, that famous triptych. The new government has dropped the partner part of that triptych. They still talk about cooperation, but they don't define China as a partner anymore. I think that is very relevant, and it gives support to those voices and those actors in the European context that want to pursue a strategy of pushing back. And we do have leverage, and the European Commission has shown that it is willing to use some of the tools, the trade defense instruments that we created over the last 6 years. And of course, as I said before, there's not unanimity. The German automotive industry was dead set opposed to the EV tariffs. But all other industrial sectors in Germany were in favor of those tariffs. I think that's a big turnaround. And also the fact that there is a kind of bifurcation in the German business community, where some multinational corporations that have put too many eggs into that one Chinese basket in the past are still hoping to get off lightly. Whereas the major part of the German business community, which is the SME, the so-called German Mittelstand, they are more circumspect, they're more critical, they take a different attitude. So I think we're already in the process of changing that policy actively.
Thank you. It's really interesting to know, and we will get later, hopefully can get some of your take on the upcoming EU-China summit and what are you looking forward to. Liz, you have firsthand experience helping shape the US policy toward China. A core premise of the US policy in recent years has been that China harbors this long-term ambition to displace the US as the leading global power. Do you think, it's a little related to the question to Steve, do you think President Trump shares that view? And what do you think are the most important differences between the Biden and Trump approaches to China? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ling Ling. It's great to be here with you and with Steve and Reinhardt. So I actually do think that President Trump shares the view of former President Biden that China seeks to replace the United States as the leading power on the global stage. He has said so several times, actually, just in the past 6 months. But I also think he probably has a different conception of what U.S. leadership on the global stage means than President Biden did. And I think it's a narrower conception, a narrower construct. So I think, first of all, I think he's focused overwhelmingly on the economic relationship. I think, as Steve identified, on trade. I think there is a military component. I think he is concerned about that as well. And the U.S., his administration has said that the security in Indo-Pacific is second only as a national security priority to border security. So that has been put out there formally. But I don't think he has, as part of his platform, which was quite central to the Biden administration, a sense of the moral imperative of the United States, leading the free world, democracy as a value. And I think you can look at what's happened in the State Department recently. They've taken off their website, for example, the value of defending free and fair elections, right? There are a number of issues now which our State Department, around the issue of human rights, is no longer engaged in on the global stage. So I think that whole pillar, which has been quite traditional for both Democrat and Republican presidents, over the past, 70 years, is, I think, not part of this administration's, or not part of the president's vision for U.S. leadership. I think also, hearkening back to Ambassador Balakrishna's remarks about the magnanimous hegemon, I don't think there's much evidence of the United States in this administration as the magnanimous hegemon. I think the America First sort of framing is very much a I win, you lose, you win, I lose. So, and I think there's a much more transactional element to it. I think the president's made clear that he thinks the United States has borne not only too much of the burden in terms of global security, but also too much of the burden when it comes to global public health, not interested in leading on issues like climate change. So a pretty significant withdrawal from not only leadership, but just participation in many multilateral institutions. And I think that's a big difference as well between the Biden administration and the Trump administration in terms of what we would constitute as U.S. leadership on the global stage. I think briefly, I could spend a long time talking about the differences as I see them between the Biden administration strategy and Trump administration's strategy, or not really strategy, I think, as Steve suggested. Look, Biden administration was pretty clear. Tony Blinken, Secretary of State Blinken, put out there in May of 2022, invest, align, compete, right? We're going to invest in, our own economy, develop, become competitive for the 21st century. That was CHIPS and Science, the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law. These were the necessary sort of components to enable the United States to be competitive for the 21st century with China. And I think it speaks to a line that has always stuck with me when Secretary, I don't want to call him Tony, Secretary of State Blinken and Jake Sullivan met with Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi, where he said, we need to be able to negotiate from a position of strength. And I think really the first 3 years almost of the Biden administration were devoted to that objective, being able to negotiate from a position of strength. So that meant in the first instance developing our own economic resilience. I think second, aligning with our allies and partners. So a huge push, not only with our Asian allies, where I think the first Trump administration did a pretty good job, but also with our European partners, and a whole range of new institutions, I won't go into all of them, designed to promote that kind of collaboration and cooperation. And then finally, the compete part, which sitting in the Department of Commerce, I would just say on the economic front, had everything to do with, both export controls, investment, in and outbound investment restrictions, and developing supply chain resiliency. So again, the tools that would enable us to defend against unfair Chinese practices or malign practices, and also to project, right, with our supply chain resiliency, I would say. So I think those were the major parts of the Biden administration strategy. In the last year, there were some elements of cooperation as well. But I think, Nick, you would agree, they were fairly limited. We tried, but they were mostly directed toward establishing channels of communication. In terms of actual concrete successes that the administration achieved working with China, I think were pretty limited. I think for the Trump administration strategy, I think they came in with sort of two. I would say the economic side, what it sounded like was we were going to be moving from a de-risking sort of approach, which I think was part of the Biden administration, to more of a decoupling. We were going to take the action on the tariffs. We were going to be stronger on export controls. I think there's been inconsistencies in how that's been delivered. We don't need to go into them, or we could later. But I don't think we could hold them to that at this point, just watching what happened. I mean, we sent the head of BIS, which is responsible for export controls, to the negotiations in London, which suggests that actually export controls are up for negotiation, which was something in the Biden administration we said, those are not ever up for negotiation because they relate to our national security, right? That's what export controls are about. So that's a pretty, again, a little bit of an inconsistency or I'm not sure what's happening. And then on the security front, I think if you look at Secretary Hegseth's speech at Shangri-La, dialogue, he said right up front, China is an imminent threat, but the strategy was not necessarily articulated all that clearly. It mostly was, and so partners and allies in Asia, you need to spend more on your defense, you need to buy American arms. He did say that any military action against Taiwan would be met with devastating consequences. So I think there have been signals, and then again, we've seen questions about whether or not we will continue to support AUKUS. So I think there have been signals of a strategy emerging, but a lot of inconsistencies in terms of policies and tactics that have come out after that. So I think it hasn't gelled. And I think, I'll just finish with this, I think a big part of the problem is that Steve already described President Trump and how he operates, but I think there's a big difference between the cabinet that we had in Trump 1 and what we have in Trump 2. And I think in Trump 1, you had a cabinet that had very deep and broad expertise on China, and they were able to craft a coherent China strategy. And I don't think that's the case with this administration.
Thank you. A lot of food for thought, and I particularly want to follow up on what Liz talked about, the inconsistencies in some of the things the Trump administration are doing when it comes to export controls. Steve, you mentioned that for the near term at least, President Trump really wants to have a deal with China. And President Trump has said he would like China to open up. However, President Xi Jinping appears to have no intention of really changing China's economic model that produces excessively and displaces competition globally. What do you think in the negotiations with the Chinese, what do you think the Trump administration should prioritize? Right, they want the deal. So what would the deal look like? Is it just about TikTok, about fentanyl, about rare earths, about purchases? What should they prioritize? And what leverage do you think they should be prepared to use to achieve that priority? Thank you.
Yeah, so I want to kick off by coming back to two things Liz said. One is the lack yet of a coherent security policy in the Trump administration. And while there is certainly ample evidence to draw that conclusion, I'd also hasten to add that we're 6 months into the administration. And 6 months into the first Trump term, we had a cabinet that was not the same cabinet 2 years later when coherence began to coalesce inside the policy. So we got a long way to go, folks. And but so far, it's a work in progress. I would definitely agree with that. The other is that Liz said we don't know, she didn't know, but none of us really know what's going on inside the negotiations. But I actually think we know more than we think. So when it comes to this agreement that was announced about 2 weeks ago, I think there's ample circumstantial evidence now to suggest that there was a standstill agreement where the Chinese would relax restrictions that they had put on critical minerals and industrial magnets in exchange for the United States freezing export controls on technology to China and some selective retreat from those export controls. And with no fanfare, a decision was made to loosen constraints on silicon chips just this week. with no announcement, no justification behind it. But I think we have enough circumstantial evidence to know what that interim agreement was to reach a peace while they negotiated a larger deal. And the larger deal, I think we also know a lot more about that than we think we might from watching outside, because it's very likely to resemble in its broad contours the Phase 1 trade deal that was negotiated between 2017 and 2020. And at the heart of that was a substantial purchase of U.S. agricultural and industrial goods. The president uses the trade balance as his singular yardstick to measure the economic fairness in bilateral relations with any country around the world, including allies. And it's no different in the case of China. And the president's focus on this is a short-term objective, because the Chinese actually are playing for time here. And while I said that they were quick to start negotiations and will be slow to close them, they also recognize at a certain point they're going to have to pay a certain price to make to create at least some temporary balance in the U.S.-China trade relationship. The question is, will that extend to deeper structural reforms on issues like respect for intellectual property or the export of Chinese overcapacity? And that's much less likely in this agreement, but that's not to say that it won't be addressed, because there really were only three ways that we as an outside party were ever going to influence China's decisions on how it runs its own domestic economic policy. One, which we tried exhaustively in the first decade and decade and a half after China's entry in the WTO, was technical dialogue, government to government, the strategic and economic dialogue, the Joint Committee on Commerce and Trade that got into the granular structural problems of the Chinese economy that would open it up to the rest of the world. But I think it's a reasonable conclusion to say the Chinese were largely diddling us during that entire discussion. They didn't do anything to rectify those fundamental issues, and there's nothing we could do from the outside to persuade them to do so. Too many vested interests, too many national objectives. If anything, they doubled down. The second way that we might have affected Chinese considerations in these issues is by creating a competitive balance outside China, by developing enough scale in the global marketplace to basically incentivize the Chinese to play by everyone else's rules. We had trade negotiations like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership that would have unified the U.S. economy with the European economy, with the broader Indo-Pacific economy. And this scale outside of China would have left China in a position where it had to make some tough choices itself on how to remain competitive and how to have access to that market. But that failed as well. And that failed largely because the tide began to shift on globalization and on trade. And so the third possibility, which may be the outcome of President Trump's negotiations, is you simply put enough barriers around China's economy to prevent them from transshipping or exporting that overcapacity that essentially leaves them drowning in overcapacity and forced to make very, very tough domestic political and economic policy decisions to rectify the problems themselves. And that may, in the end, be the most successful. And so in these negotiations that the Trump administration is undertaking with trade partners around the world, there is now a boilerplate provision of higher tariffs on transshipped Chinese goods. So the Chinese are not going to be able to use back doors to get into the U.S. economy. Truth be known, many of those countries are more than happy to have that because it justifies their efforts to prevent deindustrialization of their own economies by blaming it on the United States of America, but actually trying to protect their own domestic manufacturing as well. The other thing that this is likely to be driven by is that while the United States, while the president has already made clear there's going to be a minimum 10% tariff for any final agreement with any trading partner around the world, it's very likely he's going to push that number higher for China. And these two factors, blocking transshipment of goods, playing to the interests of other countries to keep China from overwhelming their industrial base, and making it more expensive for China to export its goods to the United States market, may possibly create enough pressure that the Chinese finally take on the politically tough challenge. And I have some empathy for them. Restructuring that economy is going to be painful because it was 2 decades in the building, and it's going to take just as long to rationalize it and create a sustainable economic model that's driven in a balance of domestic economic demand and export of goods in which the Chinese have comparative advantage. But that's not where we are today, but maybe the Trump administration's negotiations, not as the top priority, because the president wants a big, splashy purchase of several $100 billion of American goods, but maybe in the end, it also proves to be the right way to reform the Chinese economy.
Well, here's hoping. Thank you. Reinhard, there is a perception that Beijing, you talked about earlier that Europe does have leverage over China, but there is a perception in Beijing these days that, they feel that they're pretty much undeterred by the prospect of European economic retaliation. This really raises a crucial question about the EU leverage. What significant and perhaps painful economic measures is the EU prepared to deploy to alter China's cost-benefit analysis? Are previously untouchable areas like access to Europe's aerospace or advanced manufacturing sectors now part of that strategic consideration? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I would like to emphasize that I agree with the logic that Stephen just explained. I think there's no point in hoping that at some moment in the future we would negotiate Xi to grant us reciprocity or any of the kind, or to be more lenient on the chances for our companies to do business in China. But we do have leverage, and I think we should have a wide scope when you think about that. We do have leverage because of, let me put this very succinctly, because of the pressure that President Trump is exercising on China. As they have fewer opportunities of entering the US market, they're under more pressure to try stabilizing their access to the European market, because that's the other big accessible market that they could have. So in that regard, if we start using that dependency that they have on our market and also on access to our technologies, I think there is something to be done. When we talk to Chinese academics or think tankers and ask them what they want of us, the number one item they would mention would be access to technology. I believe we can work on that, and of course we have to be willing to suffer some pain. You can never inflict impact without suffering some yourself. And give you an example, that's the EV tariffs. That's not a very entertaining perspective for the German automotive industry, because Volkswagen has been relying on the perspective of re-exporting EVs that they built in China to the European market. So their business model depends on not having EV tariffs. That's the reason why they fight against it. We still have to insist on that, so that inflicts pain. I don't think we should look for maximizing pain. I would not talk about putting tariffs on dolls. Would focus on strategic industries. But I think we should also go beyond that arena. For instance, there is a necessity to shape a good narrative. China tries to frame what we're doing as the privileged industrialized nations trying to keep developing nations from rising. And they appeal to the global south and other countries saying, look, you help our rise and you will rise after us, but if you don't help us fighting the West, nobody will rise. Effectively, and you alluded to that, and it's also been mentioned yesterday, I think, there are nations in the global south that are suffering from Chinese over-subsidized exports of overproduction. Indonesia is one example. In Chile, they closed the only steel plant they had because they couldn't compete with highly subsidized Chinese steel exports to the country. So I think we should work with these partners to develop a different narrative, saying, and this is what Secretary Gates once said at the Shangri-La Dialogue Forum, we don't oppose China's rise as long as it doesn't prevent everybody else's rise. I think that could be our narrative. And that would imply that we team up with hypothetical partners, like, for instance, resource-rich countries. We're now heavily dependent on Chinese rare earth. The Chinese don't control rare earth mining altogether, but they have a quasi-monopoly of rare earth processing. Now, we could finance schemes of helping resource-rich countries develop their own processing capacities, which would give them a leg up with regard to the industrialization they seek, and would give us access to a source for industrial raw materials that China would not control. So that is also part of fighting back, of using leverage by having a wider scope of what we could be doing. And of course, there is some consequence that few in Europe would yet be willing to say loudly, which is, I believe, in the final analysis, there cannot be an insistence on free trade with a non-free market economy. So this thinking hasn't taken hold in Europe yet, but I think that's where we're going, where we have to be going.
My last question is to Liz. We talked so much, I'm sorry, just one more question. We talked so much about the Trump administration, what they're doing, what they're thinking. Let's shift focus a little bit to China itself. What do you think China wants from the Trump administration? What does it understand in terms of opportunities and challenges presented by the Trump administration? Thank you.
So since we're already over time, I'll try to be very brief. I think China wants probably two big things. Number one, I think it wants respect. I think it wants acknowledgement from the Trump administration that China is a power equal to that of the United States. Second, I think it wants the United States to leave it alone. It wants it to leave it alone so that it can pursue its own vision of reclaiming the territory that it considers to be its sovereign territory, like Taiwan, South China Sea. Leave it alone to become the #1 technology power, so no containment, no export controls, to Steve's point, and to refashion, I think, the entire international system. And I think we haven't had any discussion of these kinds of issues on this panel. We've really focused, I think, 99% on economic issues and some on the security, but this is a much bigger vision that China has around how you define human rights, the end of the US-led alliance system, de-dollarization of the global economy. There are big transformations that China has in its mind for the way that the international system, should operate. And I think that's also what the Trump administration should be focused on, but I fear is probably not.
Thank you so much. I'm like a reporter on deadline, always trying to get more time to finish the story. But thank you so much. I wish we had more time. Thank you to our
to our panelists.
Yeah,
thank you to our panelists in Ling Ling. Just a few notes. Downstairs now, we're going to be having a wonderful book talk with Vali Nasser and Jim Shuto, and drinks are being served and some snacks. Tomorrow, we're giving everybody a lie-in. We'll start at 9:30 in the morning with an excellent panel on U.S. competitiveness. Otherwise, we hope you enjoyed the day. All of our videos are up, and thank you very much. Please enjoy the book or enjoy your evening, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Good evening.